"Step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice flat, controlled, like he'd already decided how this would end. The red and blue lights washed over the quiet street in slow pulses, reflecting off rain-slick asphalt and the polished black surface of the sedan, each flash cutting the night into fragments of tension and silence. Naomi Carter didn't move right away. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, fingers steady, breath measured, as if she were listening to something deeper than the command itself. Around them, a few parked cars sat dark and still, windows catching glimpses of the scene like silent witnesses. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, the other tapping once against the roof of her car, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed louder than it should have in the empty air. "I said step out," he repeated, louder this time, not angry, just certain. Naomi slowly opened the door, the hinge creaking softly, and stepped out into the cold night, her heels touching the pavement with quiet precision. She wore a simple navy suit, tailored but unassuming, the kind that didn't demand attention but didn't shrink from it either. A light drizzle clung to the fabric, tiny droplets catching the flashing lights like scattered glass. Brooks circled the car with practiced ease, his gaze scanning, measuring, already writing a story in his head before a single word was exchanged. "License and registration," he said, though she had already handed them over minutes ago. He didn't look at them now. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the open door, eyes narrowing as if searching for something only he expected to find. The air felt tighter, heavier, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Naomi stood still, arms relaxed at her sides, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the situation, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate him. "You nervous?" he asked, a faint edge slipping into his tone. She met his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. "Should I be?" The question lingered between them, unanswered, stretching the silence just a second too long. Brooks let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. He turned back toward the car, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if he had already made a decision and was simply following through. From the corner of the street, a porch light flicked on. A curtain shifted. Someone was watching. The sound of distant traffic hummed low, indifferent, a reminder that the world kept moving even when moments like this held everything still. Brooks reached into the vehicle, his shoulder blocking the view for a second, and when he stepped back, there was something small in his gloved hand, sealed, unmistakable. He held it up just enough for the light to catch it. "You want to explain this?" he said quietly, almost conversational now, but the weight of the words landed hard. Naomi's eyes flicked to the object, then back to him, her face unchanged, her breathing still even. For a brief second, something passed between them, something unspoken, something off-script. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, red, blue, painting them both in shifting colors that made it hard to tell where certainty ended and doubt began. Brooks took a step closer, lowering his voice. "This is where things get serious." Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him not like a suspect studies an officer, but like someone observing a mistake unfold in real time. "It already is," she said softly. The words didn't rise. They didn't push, but they landed. And for just a fraction of a second, his grip tightened, his expression flickered, and the night, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath. The small plastic bag caught the light again as Officer Brooks turned it between his fingers, slow and deliberate, like he was giving her one last chance to react the way he expected. But Naomi Carter did not move, did not flinch, did not even shift her weight, and that stillness seemed to press against the moment harder than any protest could have. The drizzle thickened slightly, soft drops tapping against the hood of the car and the pavement, each one audible in the quiet stretch of street as if the night itself was listening. Brooks exhaled through his nose and stepped back half a pace, creating distance not for safety but for control, for optics, for the invisible audience he always imagined was watching, even when only a porch light and a silhouette behind a curtain bore witness. "Turn around," he said, voice even, practiced, already moving through the sequence in his mind. Naomi glanced briefly at the empty street, then back at him, her expression unchanged, and slowly she complied, placing her hands behind her back without resistance, without hesitation, as if she had already accepted something deeper than the situation itself. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked softly into place, not loud, not dramatic, just final, and the sound seemed to linger longer than it should have. Brooks tightened them with a small adjustment, precise, methodical, his movements efficient, but there was a faint tension in his jaw now, something tightening beneath the surface that he did not acknowledge. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, reciting the words with a rhythm that had become automatic over the years, the familiar cadence of authority filling the space between them. But Naomi's breathing stayed slow, measured, as if she were listening to something entirely different. A car passed at the far end of the block, headlights sweeping briefly across them, illuminating the scene in stark white before fading back into darkness, leaving behind the steady pulse of red and blue. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," he continued, though the phrase seemed to hang strangely in the air this time, as if it carried a weight neither of them fully acknowledged yet. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet alignment with herself, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "Then I will let the law speak for itself." Brooks paused for half a second, just enough for the break to register, then resumed, finishing the recitation without comment, guiding her toward the patrol car with a firm but controlled motion. The back door opened with a hollow sound, and she lowered herself inside, the interior dim, the faint smell of vinyl and cold air settling around her. The door closed, sealing her into a small, contained silence, the outside world reduced to flashes of color through reinforced glass. Brooks walked around to the driver's side, his boots striking the pavement in steady rhythm, and slid into his seat, pulling the door shut behind him. For a moment, he did not start the engine. He just sat there, hands resting lightly on the wheel, staring forward as the lights continued their relentless pulse. The radio crackled softly, a distant voice calling out a routine update, numbers and street names blending into the background, but he did not respond right away. In the rearview mirror, Naomi's reflection was steady, her posture upright despite the confined space, her gaze directed forward, not at him, not at anything specific, just forward, as if she were already somewhere else, beyond this moment. Brooks finally reached for the radio, pressing the button with his thumb. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said, his voice returning to its professional tone. "I have one in custody for possession. Female, mid-30s. No resistance." The words were clean, simple, stripped of context, stripped of nuance, reduced to a report that fit neatly into the system. "Copy that, Unit 12, the voice replied. "Transport to Central." He released the button and started the engine, the low rumble filling the cabin, and pulled away from the curb, the tires cutting through the thin layer of rain on the road. The street receded behind them, the porch light dimming into the distance, the silent witness disappearing as if it had never been there at all. Inside the car, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint rhythm of the wipers moving across the windshield, back and forth, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. Brooks adjusted the mirror slightly, just enough to keep her in view, and for a brief moment, their eyes met through the reflection. There was no fear in hers, no anger either, just something steady, something unshaken, and it unsettled him in a way he could not quite place. He looked away first, focusing on the road ahead, tightening his grip on the wheel just a fraction. The city lights grew brighter as they approached downtown, buildings rising in the distance, windows glowing like distant signals, and somewhere beneath the routine, beneath the report, beneath the quiet certainty he had carried into the night, something small and persistent began to press against the edges of his confidence, not loud enough to name, not clear enough to confront, but present, like a question waiting for the right moment to be asked. The patrol car rolled into the station lot under a wash of harsh white lights that flattened everything into sharp edges and muted colors, the rain now reduced to a fine mist that clung to the windshield like a thin veil. Brooks parked in a marked space near the side entrance and turned off the engine, and for a moment the sudden quiet felt louder than the drive itself. The ticking of cooling metal filling the cabin in uneven intervals while the red and blue lights finally went dark, leaving only the steady glow of overhead fixtures. Naomi remained still in the back seat, her reflection faint in the glass partition, posture unchanged, hands secured behind her back, her breathing even and unhurried, as if the transition from street to station had not altered the weight of the moment at all. Brooks stepped out, the door closing with a dull thud, and walked around to the rear, keys in hand, movements precise but just a fraction tighter than before, as though he were moving slightly ahead of his own thoughts. He opened the back door and gestured. "Watch your step," he said, the words automatic, stripped of tone. Naomi leaned forward and stepped out carefully, her heels clicking against the concrete in a measured rhythm that echoed faintly against the building walls. And for a brief second the sound seemed to draw the attention of a nearby officer standing by the entrance, who glanced over, then looked again, his expression flickering with mild curiosity before settling back into routine indifference. Inside, the station carried the familiar mix of low voices, distant phones ringing, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that cast everything in a pale, almost colorless glow. The air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and something metallic, a scent that lingered in places where time stretched and compressed at the same time. Brooks guided Naomi toward the booking desk, where a middle-aged desk sergeant sat behind a terminal, glasses perched low on his nose as he typed slowly, each keystroke deliberate. He did not look up immediately. "One for processing," Brooks said, placing a small evidence bag on the counter with controlled care. The sergeant glanced at the bag first, then at Naomi, then finally at Brooks, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if something in the alignment did not quite match his expectation. "Name?" he asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Brooks shifted his weight. "Naomi Carter," he replied. The sergeant paused for half a beat before typing, the keys clicking louder now in the quiet pocket of space around them, and the name appeared on the screen, reflected faintly in his glasses. "Date of birth," he continued. Naomi answered calmly, her voice steady, each word clear and measured, and the sergeant entered the information without comment, though his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his focus sharpening as he read something on the monitor that Brooks could not yet see. The overhead light flickered once, briefly dimming and returning, and in that split second the room seemed to hold its breath. A younger officer leaned casually against a nearby desk, arms crossed, watching with idle interest, but his gaze lingered a little longer than usual, drifting between Naomi's composed expression and the screen the sergeant was now studying more closely. Brooks cleared his throat softly. "Possession," he added, tapping the evidence bag once, a subtle insistence on the narrative he had already set in motion. The sergeant nodded slowly but did not respond right away. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the screen, scrolling, the faint glow reflecting more sharply now, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention immediately, but enough to register as a hesitation that did not belong in a routine booking. Naomi stood quietly, her gaze directed forward, not at the sergeant, not at Brooks, just forward, as if she were allowing the process to unfold at its own pace without interference. The younger officer straightened slightly, sensing the change without understanding it, his casual stance tightening into something more attentive. Brooks glanced at the screen, then back at the sergeant. "Everything good?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The sergeant did not answer immediately. Instead, he tapped a few more keys, slower now, deliberate, as if confirming something he did not want to assume. The room around them continued as normal, phones ringing, footsteps passing, voices blending into background noise. But at the desk, time seemed to narrow, focusing into a single point of tension that had not yet revealed its shape. Finally, the sergeant leaned back slightly, eyes still on the monitor, and exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that carried more weight than it should have. "Just a second," he said, almost to himself, and reached for the phone beside the terminal, his hand pausing just before lifting it, as if recognizing that whatever came next would not fit into the routine that had brought them here. Brooks watched him, a faint crease forming between his brows, while Naomi remained still, her presence calm and grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the subtle shift now rippling through the room, like the first sign of a storm that had not yet broken but could no longer be ignored. The sergeant's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment longer before finally lifting the receiver, the cord stretching slightly as he brought it to his ear, his eyes never leaving the screen in front of him. and whatever he was seeing there had clearly shifted something beneath the surface, because his posture was no longer casual, no longer routine, but alert in a quiet, contained way that did not announce itself yet could not be ignored. Brooks noticed it immediately, the subtle change in tension, the way the air around the desk felt different now, heavier, more focused, and he straightened just a fraction, his gaze moving from Naomi to the monitor, then back again as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation that no longer aligned. "Yeah," the sergeant said into the phone, his voice lower than before, controlled. "I need a quick confirmation. On a name. Naomi Carter." And he paused, listening, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as the voice on the other end responded, the silence stretching just long enough to draw the attention of the younger officer nearby, who shifted his stance and uncrossed his arms, curiosity now fully engaged. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, hands still secured, shoulders relaxed, her gaze forward, not engaging, not interrupting, allowing the process to unfold with a patience that did not feel passive but intentional, as if she understood something the room had not yet caught up to. Brooks let out a slow breath and leaned slightly toward the counter, lowering his voice. "What is the hold-up?" he asked, not confrontational, but edged with expectation. The sergeant raised a finger without looking at him, signaling for a second, his attention still locked on the call. Yes. I see it," he said quietly, and then his eyes flicked up for the first time, landing briefly on Naomi before returning to the screen, that flicker of recognition now unmistakable, even if its meaning had not been spoken aloud. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, casting a steady, pale glow that made every detail feel sharper than it should have, from the texture of the desk surface to the faint reflection of Naomi's silhouette in the glass partition behind the counter. "All right," the sergeant continued into the phone, his voice even more subdued now. "I will hold." And he lowered the receiver slightly, covering it with his hand as he turned just enough to face Brooks directly, his expression composed but no longer neutral. "Just give me a minute," he said, each word deliberate, measured, as though choosing them carefully to avoid saying too much too soon. Brooks frowned slightly, the crease between his brows deepening, and for the first time since the stop, something like uncertainty edged into his posture, subtle but present. "It is a simple possession," he replied, his tone firmer now, reinforcing the version of events he had already committed to. The younger officer glanced between them, sensing the shift without understanding it, his attention now fully anchored to the exchange at the desk. Naomi remained still, her breathing steady, her presence calm in a way that seemed to contrast more sharply with each passing second of tension building around her. The sergeant nodded once, slowly, but did not agree. Instead, he returned the phone to his ear, listening again, his face tightening in a way that confirmed whatever he had begun to suspect. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, and the use of the word carried a different weight now, a recognition of authority that did not originate from the room they were standing in. Brooks caught it, his eyes narrowing slightly, his attention sharpening as the pieces around him began to shift in ways he had not anticipated. The room's background noise seemed to fade just a fraction, not disappearing but receding, as if the focus had narrowed to this single point at the booking desk where something unseen was beginning to surface. The sergeant finally lowered the phone, placing it back in its cradle with controlled care, and exhaled softly, the breath measured, steady, but carrying the quiet gravity of a realization that could not be undone. He looked at the screen one more time, then at Naomi, then at Brooks, and the order of that glance alone said more than any immediate explanation could have. "Officer Brooks," he began, his voice calm but distinctly different now, no longer procedural, no longer routine. "There is a flag on this identity," and he let the words settle for a fraction of a second before continuing, "and it is not a minor one." Brooks straightened, the shift now unmistakable, his confidence meeting resistance for the first time in the night. "What kind of flag?" he asked, his voice controlled but tighter, the question carrying more weight than he intended. The sergeant did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the monitor slightly, just enough for Brooks to see the top line of information reflected in the glass, the text small but unmistakable, and though it was only a glimpse, only a fraction of what the system held, It was enough to introduce a crack in the narrative that had seemed so certain minutes ago. Naomi's reflection remained steady in the background, unchanged, as if she had been standing in this exact moment long before it arrived, waiting not for the truth to appear, but for others to finally see it. Brooks leaned in slightly as the monitor turned just enough to catch his eye, the glow from the screen reflecting faintly across his face. And for a brief second the confidence that had carried him through the stop, the arrest, the drive, and the booking process seemed to hesitate, not gone but interrupted, like a sentence cut short before it could finish. The text on the screen was not large, not dramatic, just a line among many. But it carried a weight that did not belong to routine entries, a designation that did not fit the narrative he had already constructed. "That is not possible," Brooks said quietly, almost to himself, his voice lower than before, the certainty now edged with something tighter, something less stable. The sergeant did not respond immediately. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on the desk, fingers spread, grounding himself as he looked from the screen to Naomi again, this time with clear recognition settling into place. Not surprise, not shock, but a realization that aligned the present moment with something larger, something already established beyond the walls of the station. The younger officer shifted closer, drawn in by the tension that now hung openly in the air, his earlier curiosity replaced with a more focused attention, his gaze flicking to the monitor, then to Brooks, then to Naomi, as if trying to assemble the pieces before anyone spoke them aloud. Naomi remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, her eyes forward, not demanding acknowledgement, not offering explanation, simply existing within the truth that had yet to be fully recognized by the room. The fluorescent light above flickered once more, briefly dimming before stabilizing, and in that momentary dip, the reflection in the glass seemed sharper, the outlines clearer, as if the environment itself was adjusting to the shift taking place. "It says restricted," Brooks continued, his voice tightening slightly as he processed what he was seeing. "That does not mean anything. That could be anything." The sergeant finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and shook his head once, not dismissively, but with quiet certainty. "It does not say just restricted," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "It says federal-level access, judicial classification." The words did not rise in volume, but they landed heavily, filling the space between them with a clarity that could no longer be avoided. The younger officer's posture straightened immediately, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to alertness, a recognition that whatever this situation was, it had just moved beyond routine in a way that required attention. Brooks stared at the screen for a moment longer, his jaw tightening, his mind moving quickly through possibilities, searching for an explanation that would bring the situation back under control, back into the boundaries he understood. "Names can match," he said, his voice more deliberate now. "It does not mean it is her." The sergeant nodded slowly, acknowledging the point, but did not move away from his position. "That is why I called," he replied, and there was a quiet emphasis in his words that suggested the answer had already come. A phone rang somewhere behind them, sharp and brief, then was picked up and absorbed into the background, but the sound seemed distant, disconnected from the focus at the desk. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the movement subtle, controlled, and the faint sound of her heels against the floor drew Brooks's attention back to her, his gaze lingering a fraction longer than before, searching now not for confirmation of guilt, but for something else, something he had not considered when the night began. She met his glance briefly, not challenging, not defensive, simply present, and in that brief exchange there was a stillness that contrasted sharply with the growing tension around them. The sergeant reached toward the keyboard again, tapping a few keys with careful precision, pulling up an additional layer of information, and the screen updated with a quiet flicker that seemed louder in the silence. He turned the monitor a little more this time, not fully, but enough that Brooks could no longer avoid what was displayed. The name aligned with credentials that extended far beyond a standard identification, far beyond anything that would appear in a typical booking process. Verification came back, the sergeant said, his voice steady, measured, each word placed with intent. "It is confirmed." The younger officer took a small step back, as if instinctively giving space to the realization that had now fully entered the room, his earlier casual stance completely gone. Brooks did not speak immediately. His grip on the edge of the desk tightened slightly, the subtle shift visible in the tension of his hand, and for the first time, the narrative he had carried with certainty began to fracture under the weight of what he could now see. Naomi stood quietly, the same calm presence she had held from the moment the lights first flashed behind her car, unchanged, unshaken, and in that stillness there was a quiet gravity that made everything else in the room feel louder, more exposed, more fragile. The sergeant straightened his posture, his role now clearly defined not by routine, but by responsibility to something larger, something that extended beyond the station itself. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "we need to proceed carefully from here." And though the words were simple, the meaning behind them marked a clear shift, a line that had been crossed without recognition now coming sharply into focus, leaving no room for the certainty that had once seemed so easy. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, settling over the desk like a weight that no one could ignore anymore, and Brooks felt it, the subtle shift from control to uncertainty pressing against his chest in a way he could not immediately push back. He straightened slowly, releasing his grip on the desk, as if loosening his hold on something less visible, his eyes moving once more to Naomi, searching now with a different intention, not to confirm a suspicion but to reconcile a contradiction that had already begun to unravel his certainty. Carefully, he repeated, his voice quieter now, the edge softened but not gone, just redirected. The sergeant nodded once, his posture firm, grounded in the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "Yes," he said, each word deliberate, "because this is not a standard situation anymore." The younger officer shifted again, stepping slightly to the side, as if instinctively making space, his earlier curiosity now replaced by a clear awareness that something significant had just crossed into their routine, something that required distance, attention, and restraint. Naomi remained still, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, and that consistency seemed to amplify the tension around her, as if everything else in the room was adjusting while she remained exactly where she had always been. Brooks let out a slow breath, his gaze flicking briefly to the evidence bag still resting on the counter, then back to the screen, then finally settling on Naomi again. "You want to explain this?" he asked, but the question no longer carried the same weight it had on the street, no longer an accusation, but something closer to a request for clarity that he had not been prepared to need. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes fully this time, and there was no urgency in her expression, no rush to correct him, only a calm that felt deliberate, measured, and entirely in control of itself. "There is nothing to explain," she said quietly, her voice steady, each word placed with care. "Only something for you to understand." The sentence settled into the silence with a quiet force that seemed to shift the balance of the room again, subtle but undeniable. Brooks held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed the implication behind her words, the realization that the narrative he had constructed was no longer holding its shape. The sergeant reached toward the counter and gently moved the evidence bag aside, not dismissing it, but repositioning it as if acknowledging that its significance had changed. "We need to verify everything," he said, more to the process than to Brooks, though the message was clear. Brooks nodded once, slowly, the motion controlled but carrying the weight of adjustment, of recalibration. "Then verify it," he replied, his voice returning to a more neutral tone, though the underlying tension remained, quieter now, more contained. The younger officer glanced toward the hallway, then back at the desk, clearly debating whether to step away or remain, but choosing to stay, drawn by the unfolding shift he could not yet fully define. Naomi shifted her stance slightly, the faint sound of her heels against the floor echoing softly, and for a moment her gaze moved beyond the desk, beyond Brooks, settling somewhere deeper into the space, as if she were measuring not the moment itself, but what would follow it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady, unchanging, their pale glow flattening the scene into clarity, removing shadows, leaving everything exposed. The sergeant began typing again, pulling up additional records, his movements precise, his focus unwavering. each keystroke deliberate as he navigated through layers of information that extended beyond the immediate situation. To Naomi, and the shift in his expression now carried a quiet confirmation that whatever had begun as a routine stop had crossed into something far more significant. "We are going to need a supervisor," he said, his tone steady, professional, but unmistakably firm, and as the words settled into the room, the boundary between assumption and reality finally became impossible to ignore. The word supervisor seemed to shift the air in the room in a way nothing else had so far, subtle but immediate, like a line being drawn that could not be stepped back across. And for the first time since the stop, Brooks did not respond right away. He stood there, shoulders squared but no longer rigid, his attention split between the sergeant, the screen, and Naomi, each one holding a piece of a reality he had not fully accepted yet. The younger officer moved first, turning slightly toward the hallway, his instincts now aligned with procedure rather than observation, and he stepped away without being told, his footsteps quick but controlled as he disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier in his absence. The sergeant reached for the phone again, his movements measured, deliberate, and dialed a number with a precision that suggested this was no longer a routine escalation, but something that required careful handling. Naomi remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands still secured, her presence steady in a way that seemed to anchor the space even as everything else began to shift around her. Brooks glanced at her again, longer this time, his gaze searching, recalibrating, and there was something in the way she stood that did not align with the version of events he had built, something that refused to fit into the frame he had already decided upon. "You could have said something," he muttered, the words quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the lights, but clear enough to reach her. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "You did not ask," she replied, her voice soft but precise, and the simplicity of the answer landed with more weight than anything louder could have. Brooks exhaled, slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked away, the implications settling deeper than he wanted to admit. The sergeant spoke quietly into the phone, his tone respectful, controlled, giving only what was necessary, and as he listened, his posture straightened further, his role now clearly defined by the situation unfolding rather than the routine he had started with. Somewhere deeper in the station, a door opened and closed, the sound echoing faintly before fading back into the steady background noise. But at the desk, the focus remained fixed, contained, as if the rest of the building had receded into the distance. The evidence bag sat untouched now, pushed slightly to the side, no longer the center of the narrative, just an object waiting for its meaning to be reevaluated. Brooks noticed it again, his eyes lingering on it for a brief second, and something in his expression shifted, not fully formed, not yet acknowledged, but present, like a thought he was not ready to name. The sergeant ended the call and set the receiver down carefully, his hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary before he looked up, his gaze moving first to Naomi, then to Brooks. "Lieutenant Harris is on his way," he said, his voice steady, the name carrying a quiet authority that settled into the room without needing emphasis. Brooks nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but the certainty behind it was no longer the same as before. It was measured now, restrained, aware of something larger moving into place. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the faint sound of her heels against the floor echoing again, and for a brief moment her eyes moved toward the entrance, as if acknowledging the next phase before it arrived. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting the same pale glow over everything. But the atmosphere beneath them had changed, no longer routine, no longer predictable, now shaped by a tension that had not yet reached its peak. Brooks adjusted his stance, his hands resting briefly on his belt before falling to his sides, his posture no longer that of unquestioned control, but of someone recalculating in real time. "If there is a mistake," he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, "it will be corrected." The words sounded firm, but there was a subtle shift in their foundation, less certainty, more assertion, as if he needed them to hold even as they began to loosen. Naomi looked at him again, her gaze steady, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a clarity that did not need to be spoken to be understood. "The truth does not need correction," she said softly, and the sentence settled into the space between them with a quiet finality that seemed to draw a line no one could ignore. Brooks did not respond this time. He simply looked away, his focus shifting toward the entrance as footsteps approached from the hallway, measured, confident, carrying the weight of someone who already understood that this was not a situation to be taken lightly. The younger officer reappeared first, stepping back into view with a posture that was no longer casual, his movements precise, his attention forward, and behind him, a taller figure entered the room, his presence immediately altering the balance of the space without a single word spoken. Lieutenant Harris walked with a calm, controlled pace, his eyes scanning the scene once, taking in the positions, the expressions, the subtle details that spoke louder than any report could have, and as he approached the desk, the quiet tension that had been building finally found a point of focus, something solid to anchor itself to. Brooks straightened instinctively, his posture aligning with protocol, but the shift in his demeanor was unmistakable now, no longer leading the situation, but standing within it. Harris stopped at the desk, his gaze moving from the sergeant to Naomi, then to Brooks, and in that brief sequence, something unspoken passed through the room, a recognition that the moment had crossed into a different space entirely, one where assumptions would no longer hold, and where every action would carry weight beyond what had been intended. The room fell into a quieter stillness, not empty, not silent, but focused, as if everything that had led to this point was now waiting for the next word to be spoken. Lieutenant Harris did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more authority than any raised voice could have, his eyes moving slowly across the scene, taking in the positioning, the tension, the subtle shifts in posture that revealed more than words ever would. He stopped first on Naomi, his gaze steady, assessing, not with suspicion but with recognition that had not yet been spoken aloud, then moved to the sergeant, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and finally to Brooks, whose stance had straightened into something more formal, more contained, as if trying to regain alignment with a structure that was already shifting beneath him. "Walk me through it," Harris said at last, his voice calm, even, carrying a quiet weight that settled over the room without effort. Brooks inhaled once, controlled, and began, his words precise, measured, recounting the stop, the search, the discovery, each detail presented with the same clarity he had relied on from the beginning. But now there was a subtle tension beneath the surface, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if each word had to be chosen more deliberately than he was used to. Harris listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his posture still, absorbing the account in full before shifting his attention slightly toward the sergeant. "And the flag?" he asked. The sergeant turned the monitor fully this time, no longer holding back the information, the screen now visible in its entirety, the lines of text clear, structured, undeniable, and the designation at the top sat there without emphasis, yet impossible to ignore. Harris leaned in just enough to read, his eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, and something in his face changed, not dramatically, not visibly to someone not paying attention, but enough that the air around him seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness. He straightened again and looked at Naomi, holding her gaze for a brief moment, and in that exchange there was a recognition that did not need to be confirmed aloud. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting subtly, respectful, measured. "Is there anything you would like to add?" Naomi's posture remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her hands still secured, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "Only that this situation will resolve itself through the same system it was placed into," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying a quiet certainty that did not seek to persuade, only to exist. Harris nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just her words but the weight behind them. Brooks shifted slightly beside him, the movement small but noticeable, his attention fixed now on Harris, waiting, watching, measuring the response that would define what came next. Harris turned back to the desk, his gaze moving briefly to the evidence bag, then to the report screen, and finally settling on Brooks. "Did you verify the chain of custody?" he asked, the question simple, direct, but carrying a depth that reached beyond the surface. Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to register, then answered, It was recovered on scene, he said, his voice controlled, but the certainty now felt thinner, less anchored. Harris held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the answer given. The room remained quiet, the background noise of the station continuing as usual, but here, at the desk, everything felt narrowed, focused, as if the rest of the world had stepped back to allow this moment to unfold without distraction. "Remove the cuffs," Harris said finally, his voice steady, leaving no room for hesitation. The words landed with a quiet finality that shifted the entire balance of the room in an instant. Brooks blinked once, the instruction cutting through whatever remained of his earlier certainty, and for a moment he did not move, the pause brief but unmistakable. The younger officer looked between them, his posture tightening again, waiting for confirmation, for clarity, for the next step. The sergeant remained still, his attention fixed on Brooks, not intervening, not repeating the order, simply allowing it to stand. Naomi did not move, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Brooks reached slowly for the key at his belt, his movements controlled, deliberate, and stepped behind her, the faint sound of metal meeting metal as the cuffs were unlocked echoing softly in the space, a small sound that carried far more weight than its volume suggested. Naomi brought her hands forward calmly, rubbing one wrist lightly, not out of discomfort, but out of simple motion, and then let them rest at her sides, her posture unchanged, her composure intact. Harris watched the movement, then nodded once, a quiet confirmation that something had shifted into place. "We will review everything," he said, his tone firm, grounded in procedure but no longer confined by it, "and we will proceed accordingly." Brooks stepped back, his hands now at his sides, his stance no longer defined by control, but by presence within a situation that had moved beyond him, and for the first time since the night began, he did not speak, the silence around him now shaped not by authority, but by the weight of what he had yet to fully understand. Naomi stood calmly, her gaze forward, her presence steady, and in that stillness, the room seemed to settle into a new alignment, one where the truth was no longer something to be uncovered, but something that had already arrived, waiting to be recognized. The absence of the cuffs did not make the room lighter. It made it clearer, like a fog lifting just enough to reveal the shape of something that had always been there, and Brooks felt it immediately, the shift not in volume but in weight, in direction, in the way every eye now moved differently, no longer following his lead, but recalibrating around something he had not accounted for. Lieutenant Harris stepped slightly to the side, creating space without stepping back, his posture still composed, his presence steady, and he gestured toward a chair near the desk with a subtle motion that carried more respect than the words themselves. "Please," he said quietly, and Naomi inclined her head once before taking a seat, her movements controlled, unhurried, as if she had nothing to prove and nothing to reclaim, only to remain exactly as she was. The younger officer straightened further, his attention fixed, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by a careful awareness that bordered on caution. While the sergeant shifted a folder aside, clearing the desk in a small but deliberate act that signaled a change in priority. Brooks remained standing, just off to the side, his hands at his sides, his shoulders still squared but no longer anchored in the same certainty, and for the first time, he looked like someone waiting rather than someone directing. Harris turned slightly toward the monitor again, his eyes scanning the information once more, confirming not just the identity but the implications attached to it, and then he faced Naomi fully. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful, measured. "For the record, can you confirm your position?" Naomi folded her hands lightly in her lap, her posture upright, her gaze steady. "Federal District Court," she replied, her voice calm, clear, "appointed 8 years ago." The words did not rise, did not assert themselves, but they landed with a quiet finality that reshaped the entire room. And even though the information had already been seen on the screen, hearing it spoken made it real in a way that could no longer be dismissed or reinterpreted. The younger officer lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up, his posture tightening, as if aligning himself with a standard he had not realized he needed to meet. The sergeant nodded once, slow, deliberate, his earlier hesitation now replaced by a quiet certainty that the situation had moved fully into a different category. Brooks swallowed, the motion subtle but visible, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere just past the desk, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Harris did not look at him yet. Instead, he kept his attention on Naomi. "We will make sure this is handled properly," he said, each word steady, grounded, starting now. Naomi met his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once, the motion small but carrying an understanding that did not require further explanation. "That is all I ask," she said softly. The simplicity of the statement settled into the room, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence not empty but full, like a pause that allowed everything to realign. Harris then turned to Brooks, his expression composed, but the shift in focus was unmistakable, the attention now directed, intentional. "Officer," he said, not raising his voice, but the word carried a weight that demanded presence. "I need a full report, every detail, and I need it accurate." Brooks nodded immediately, the response automatic, but there was a tension beneath it now, a recognition that accuracy no longer meant control of the narrative, but exposure to it. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady but quieter than before. Harris held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the answer while already considering what would follow. The evidence bag remained on the counter, untouched, its presence now less certain, less defined, like an object waiting to be reinterpreted under a different light. The sergeant reached toward it briefly, then stopped, his hand hovering before pulling back, as if recognizing that its handling now required a different level of care. Naomi sat quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that stillness there was something grounding, something that seemed to draw the room into alignment without effort. Brooks glanced at her again, his gaze lingering for a second longer than before, and there was something in his expression now that had not been there at the start of the night, not fully formed, not yet named, but present, like the first recognition of a mistake that could not be undone simply by stepping back. Harris moved slightly, repositioning himself at the desk, his hands resting lightly on the surface as he looked between the sergeant and Brooks, then back to Naomi, and the quiet authority he carried seemed to settle everything into place, not resolving it, not closing it, but defining the space in which it would now be addressed. "We will take it from here," he said, his tone final but calm, and as the words settled, the structure of the moment shifted completely, no longer driven by assumption, no longer held together by certainty, but guided now by something steadier, something that did not need to assert itself because it was already true. The room did not move, but everything inside it shifted, like a structure settling after a quiet tremor, and Brooks could feel it in the way the air pressed differently against his chest, in the way every small sound seemed sharper, more defined, less forgiving. Lieutenant Harris remained at the desk, his posture steady, his presence anchoring the moment, while the sergeant began documenting with a renewed precision, each keystroke deliberate, each entry now carrying a weight far beyond routine processing. Naomi sat calmly, her hands folded, her gaze forward, not demanding attention, yet holding it all the same, and the contrast between her stillness and the quiet tension surrounding her only made the imbalance more visible. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but necessary, as if trying to find footing in a situation that no longer aligned with the one he had entered. "Body camera footage," Harris said, his voice even, not loud, but firm enough to cut cleanly through the silence. Brooks looked up immediately, nodding once. "It is active," he replied, his tone controlled, though there was a tightness beneath it now, a recognition that the same system that had supported his certainty would now measure it. Harris extended his hand slightly, not demanding, but expecting. Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching to his chest, unclipping the device with careful fingers and placing it on the desk with a soft, controlled motion. The small camera sat there, its presence suddenly amplified, no longer just a tool, but a witness that could not be negotiated with. The sergeant connected it to the system, the screen flickering as data loaded, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to lean toward that single point of light. Naomi did not move. Brooks did not look at her. Harris watched the screen. The footage began without sound at first, the visual unfolding in silent clarity, red and blue lights washing over the frame, the angle fixed, impartial, and then the audio followed, voices filling the room, familiar yet different when removed from the moment they were spoken in. Brooks's own voice echoed back at him, steady, controlled, confident, and he listened without expression, his face composed, but something behind. His eyes tightening as each second played out exactly as it had happened. The younger officer stood just behind, his posture straight, his attention fixed, absorbing every detail with a focus that had replaced his earlier curiosity entirely. The sergeant did not interrupt, did not comment, his hands resting lightly on the keyboard as the footage continued. The room held in a quiet suspension that allowed no distraction. Naomi's voice appeared next, calm, measured, unchanged from the way she had spoken at the desk, and the consistency of it seemed to underline something deeper, something that did not shift with circumstance. Harris leaned slightly closer, not out of urgency, but out of attention, his eyes tracking the sequence, noting not just what was said, but how, when, and in what order. Brooks's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the moment of discovery replayed, the evidence held up, the words exchanged, the tone, the pacing, every detail preserved exactly as it had been. The footage did not rush. It did not interpret. It simply showed. And in that neutrality, it carried a weight that no explanation could soften. When the scene reached the point of arrest, the room felt even quieter, the soft click of cuffs in the recording echoing faintly through the speakers, and Brooks's gaze dropped for a brief second before returning to the screen, the motion small but noticeable. Naomi's posture on the recording mirrored her posture now, steady, composed, unchanged, and the alignment between past and present created a clarity that was difficult to ignore. Harris did not look away. He watched until the end of the sequence, until the transport began, until the footage shifted to the interior of the car, and then he raised a hand slightly, signaling the sergeant to pause. The screen froze on a frame where the red and blue lights reflected across the glass, Naomi's silhouette visible, Brooks's profile steady, and the moment held there, suspended between what had happened and what it meant. Harris straightened slowly, his expression composed, but there was a gravity in it now that had not been there before, not because something new had been revealed, but because what had been revealed could no longer be set aside. He turned his head slightly toward Brooks, not sharply, not abruptly, but with a focus that carried weight. "We will continue this review," he said, his voice calm, grounded, with internal affairs present. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive in a way that shifted the direction of everything that would follow. Brooks nodded once, the motion controlled, his face still composed, but the space around him felt different now, less certain, more exposed, and for the first time, the narrative he had held was no longer something he could stand inside without question. Naomi remained seated, her presence steady, her silence unchanged, and in that stillness there was no triumph, no visible reaction, only a quiet alignment with something that had already begun to take shape beyond the walls of the station. The hum of the fluorescent lights continued, the distant sounds of the building carried on, but at the desk, the moment had shifted fully, no longer about what had happened, but about what it would now become. The words internal affairs did not echo, but they settled, heavy and immovable, like a door closing somewhere just out of sight, and Brooks felt it in the quiet that followed, a silence that was no longer neutral but weighted, defined by consequence rather than uncertainty. Lieutenant Harris remained still for a moment after speaking, his eyes returning briefly to the paused frame on the screen before shifting back to the room, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the direction of everything had clearly shifted, no longer contained within the station, no longer manageable through routine. The sergeant exhaled softly and reached for the keyboard again, his movements precise, methodical, documenting not just what had happened, but what would now follow, each entry carrying the weight of a process that extended beyond his desk. The younger officer stood a step further back now, his posture straight, his attention fixed, no longer an observer, but a witness to something that would not be forgotten once it left the room. Naomi remained seated, her hands resting lightly together, her gaze forward, and there was a quiet steadiness in her presence that did not change, did not rise or fall with the tension around her, as if she were grounded in something far deeper than the moment itself. Brooks stood where he was, his shoulders still squared, but the certainty that had once defined his stance had dissolved into something more contained, more aware, his eyes drifting briefly to the screen again before settling on the desk, the evidence bag, the small camera, each object now carrying a different meaning than it had minutes ago. "Is there anything further you would like to state at this time?" Harris asked, turning slightly toward Naomi, his tone respectful, measured, offering space rather than pressing for response. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression calm, composed, and for a moment she said nothing, allowing the question to exist fully before answering. "No," she said softly, "not here." The words were simple, but the boundary they drew was clear, a recognition that what needed to be addressed would not be contained within this room, within this moment, within this system alone. Harris nodded once, slowly, acknowledging not just the answer but the implication behind it, and he turned his attention back to Brooks, his expression composed, but now carrying a quiet gravity that had sharpened into focus. "Officer Brooks," he said, his voice steady, "from this point forward, you are to refrain from further statements regarding this incident until reviewed." Brooks nodded immediately, the response automatic, but there was a weight behind it now, an understanding that his role had shifted completely, from control to accountability. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice even, though quieter than before. The sergeant paused his typing for a brief moment, glancing up, his eyes moving between them before returning to the screen, continuing his work without interruption, but with a heightened awareness that every detail now mattered. Naomi adjusted her posture slightly in the chair, the movement small, controlled, her presence still grounded, and for a brief second her gaze moved toward Brooks, not lingering, not accusing, simply acknowledging his presence in the same space, and then returning forward, as if that was all that was necessary. Brooks noticed it, the glance, brief as it was, and something in his expression shifted again, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but present, like the beginning of recognition that could not be undone once it took hold. Harris stepped slightly to the side, creating space between himself and the desk, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer anchored to the immediate action but to the process that would now follow. "We will arrange for your release," he said to Naomi, his tone respectful, measured, and she nodded once in response, the motion calm, expected, as if the outcome had already been understood long before it was spoken. The younger officer moved quietly toward the hallway again, this time with purpose, his steps measured, precise, carrying the momentum of the moment forward into the next stage. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum overhead, unchanged, indifferent, casting the same pale glow across everything. But beneath them, the room had transformed completely, no longer a place of routine processing, but a space where something had shifted, something that would extend far beyond its walls. Brooks remained still for a moment longer, then adjusted his stance, his hands briefly touching the edge of the desk before falling back to his sides. And for the first time since the night began, he did not look at Naomi, his gaze instead fixed on a point ahead, as if trying to steady himself against something that had already begun to move beyond his reach. Naomi stood slowly from the chair, her movements unhurried, composed, and as she did, the room seemed to settle again, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had found its direction, its path forward. Harris watched her stand, then gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than formality, and in that quiet exchange, the moment reached a kind of stillness, not an ending, not a resolution, but a transition into what would come next, where the truth would no longer wait to be recognized, but would begin to be addressed in full. The station doors opened with a soft mechanical sound that barely registered against the steady hum of the building. But as Naomi stepped forward, something in the room shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the way attention followed her without being called, in the way silence formed around her movement, as if instinctively making space. Lieutenant Harris walked beside her at a measured pace, not leading, not escorting, simply present, his posture aligned with a respect that no longer needed to be stated. The hallway stretched ahead under rows of fluorescent lights, each one casting the same pale glow, the same quiet buzz. But the air felt different now, less confined, less controlled, as if the moment had expanded beyond the walls that had tried to contain it. Behind them, the sergeant continued his work, the steady rhythm of keys marking the beginning of a process that would not stop when the night ended, while the younger officer remained at his post, his posture still, his gaze following the direction they had gone, as if trying to understand how something so routine had shifted so completely. Brooks did not follow immediately. He stood at the edge of the desk, the same place where he had once held certainty, and for a moment, he did not move, his hands resting lightly against the surface as if grounding himself in something that no longer held the same meaning. The evidence bag remained there, untouched, its presence now quiet, uncertain, no longer a conclusion, but a question waiting for an answer that would not come from assumption. He looked at it, then at the paused screen, then toward the hallway where Naomi had disappeared, and something in his expression settled, not resolved, not at peace, but aware, fully aware in a way that could not be undone. In the corridor, Naomi walked with the same measured pace, her heels striking the floor in a steady rhythm that echoed softly against the walls, and Harris matched it without effort, his presence calm, contained, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. "Transportation will be arranged," he said after a few steps, his voice low, respectful, "and you will receive formal communication regarding the review." Naomi inclined her head slightly, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged. "I expected as much," she replied, her tone even, without tension, without relief, simply acknowledging what had already begun. They reached the exit, the doors sliding open again to reveal the night outside, the air cooler, fresher, carrying the faint scent of rain that had not fully settled. The parking lot stretched under wide lights, empty in places, quiet in a way that felt different from the silence inside, less confined, more open, as if the world beyond the station continued without the weight that had filled the room. Naomi stepped out, pausing for just a moment beneath the overhang, her eyes lifting briefly toward the dark sky before returning forward, and in that small movement there was no triumph, no visible reaction, only a quiet continuation of the same composure she had held from the beginning. Harris stopped just inside the doorway, not crossing the threshold, his role clearly defined within the boundary he stood in. "Ma'am," he said, and she turned slightly to face him, her expression steady. "This will be addressed," he continued, his voice firm, grounded, properly. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the motion small but certain. "That is all the system requires," she said softly. The words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, carrying a clarity that did not need reinforcement. Harris inclined his head in return, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than formality, and then he stepped back, allowing the door to close slowly between them, the glass reflecting the lights as it slid into place. Naomi walked forward into the open lot, her figure moving steadily under the glow of the overhead lights, each step measured, each movement unchanged, as if the night itself had not altered her course, only revealed the path more clearly. Inside, Brooks finally moved, stepping away from the desk with a slower, more deliberate pace than before, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, but in something quieter, something heavier. He paused near the doorway, his gaze fixed through the glass, watching her walk across the lot, and for a brief moment, everything else faded, the noise, the lights, the structure of the building, leaving only the distance between where he stood and where she was going. He did not call out. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, the reflection of his own figure faint in the glass beside hers, separated by a line that could not be crossed in the same way again. The night outside remained still, the lights steady, the air cool, and Naomi continued walking without looking back, her silhouette moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had defined every moment since the first flash of red and blue, leaving behind a space that had been forced to remember what it meant to be held accountable, not by force, not by volume, but by the simple presence of truth. The next morning did not arrive with noise or urgency, but with a quiet clarity that settled over everything like light through clean glass, steady and revealing. And inside a federal courtroom across the city, the air carried that same stillness, the kind that does not need to announce itself because everyone present already understands its weight. The room was filled but silent. Rows of polished wood benches holding observers who spoke only in glances and measured breaths, their attention drawn forward to the elevated bench where authority did not need to raise its voice to be recognized. Naomi Carter stepped into the room through a side door, her robe falling into place with a soft, controlled motion, her posture upright, her expression composed in the same quiet way it had been the night before, unchanged, untouched by the shift in circumstance because she had never moved with it, only through it. The clerk stood as she approached, the sound of a chair sliding back echoing briefly before fading, and then everything settled again as she took her seat, the wood beneath her hands cool, solid, grounding. Court is now in session, the clerk announced, the words formal, practiced, but today they carried something deeper, something that extended beyond routine into recognition. Naomi's gaze moved across the room once, steady, measured, not searching, not lingering, simply acknowledging what was present, and then it came to rest. At the defense table, Daniel Brooks stood, not in uniform, not with the same posture he had held beneath flashing lights, but in a suit that did not fit the way authority once had, his shoulders still squared, but the certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in a reality he could no longer shape. He did not look up immediately. When he did, it was brief, controlled, his eyes meeting hers for only a fraction of a second before lowering again, not out of instruction, but out of understanding. The room held that moment without sound, without movement, as if recognizing that something had already been decided long before the first word of the day was spoken. Naomi adjusted the papers in front of her, the soft rustle carrying through the silence, and when she spoke, her voice was the same as it had been in every moment before, calm, measured, precise, not raised, not forced, simply present. "We will proceed," she said, and the words did not echo, they settled, grounding the room in a structure that did not bend to assumption, did not yield to imbalance, only to truth. The attorneys moved as expected, the process unfolding with the same formal rhythm that governed every case. But beneath it, something quieter existed, something that could not be written into record, the awareness of how the moment had come to exist in the first place. Brooks stood when instructed, spoke when addressed, his voice steady but lower than before, each word chosen with care, not to control, but to align, to remain within the boundaries that had been clearly defined. Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, her presence neither punitive nor forgiving, simply exact, holding the space where accountability and dignity could exist without conflict. The room did not rush. It did not react. It allowed the process to unfold as it was meant to, without distortion, without interference, each moment placed exactly where it belonged. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place within these walls, unaware that something as simple as a decision, a glance, a moment of certainty had carried consequences far beyond its origin. Inside, Naomi lifted her hand slightly, the gavel resting beneath her fingers, and for a brief second, everything stilled, not because it was demanded, but because it was understood. The sound that followed was not loud, not forceful, just a single, measured strike, clean and final, and it did not echo through the room so much as settle into it, marking not an end, but a recognition. Naomi did not look down. She did not look away. She simply held her place, her presence steady, her voice calm as she continued, guiding the process forward with the same quiet authority that had never left her, even when the world around her had tried to shift her position. And in that stillness, in that measured rhythm of words and silence, something remained, not spoken, not written, but understood by everyone who had witnessed even a part of it. That power had never belonged to the voice that was loudest, or the hand that moved first, but to the one who remained steady when everything else moved, the one who did not need to prove what was already true.